"Trash like you doesn't belong on the 12th floor," the head nurse declared, towering over 13-year-old Benjamin Turner as he stood outside the VIP suite window, her voice dripping with contempt that had been building for years of seeing people she deemed beneath this hospital's elite level. She jabbed her finger toward the glass behind her, making sure everyone within earshot understood the hierarchy being violated. "That man lying in there is worth $5.3 billion. And Charles Whitfield is the most important patient this hospital has ever treated. So, you need to understand that some security guard's disabled son has absolutely no right to stand here staring at him like some kind of spectacle." Before Benjamin could respond, she ripped the worn notebook from his trembling hands and hurled it down the pristine hallway with enough force to make her point clear. It slammed against the wall with a sound that echoed through the corridor, and pages exploded across the polished floor like wounded birds falling from the sky. Through the window behind the nurse's rigid form, Charles Whitfield's body convulsed violently on the hospital bed, his skin having turned an alarming shade of gray while his lips darkened to an ominous blue-purple. The heart monitor was shrieking in patterns that 15 years of medical training couldn't decipher, creating a symphony of alarm that filled the room with dread. 15 of the hospital's top doctors surrounded him in a tight circle of panic, their faces showing the kind of fear that only comes when expertise fails and death approaches. Despite every intervention attempted, none of them had any idea what was systematically killing one of the most powerful men in pharmaceutical research. A man whose survival could mean millions in donations and whose death could mean the end of careers. Except for the boy they had just dismissed and thrown out like garbage. The same boy who had been trying desperately to tell them exactly what was wrong. 3 hours earlier, the 12th floor had been transformed into a completely different world from the basement where most hospital workers spent their shifts. It was Christmas Eve and the annual gala was in full swing with tickets that had cost $60,000 each. More money than Gerald Turner made in an entire year of night shifts. Champagne that cost more per bottle than a month's rent flowed freely among 200 guests dressed in designer everything. Their laughter echoing under crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than most people's houses. 12 floors below this spectacle of wealth and privilege, Benjamin Turner sat alone in a maintenance basement that perpetually smelled like mold mixed with burnt coffee. A space so far removed from the gala above that it might as well have been a different planet entirely. Charles Whitfield stood center stage in the ballroom wearing a Tom Ford suit that had cost $12,000 and looking every inch the philanthropic billionaire. His PC Philippe watches glinted under the carefully positioned lights. The two pieces on his wrist alone worth $250,000, more than many families would see in a lifetime. He raised a glass of Macallan that cost $800 per shot and delivered his carefully rehearsed lines with the practiced ease of someone who had given this same speech dozens of times before. Novartis Biosystems is incredibly proud to announce a $12 million commitment to pediatric cancer research, he declared, pausing perfectly for the wave of applause he knew would come. He smiled for the cameras that were capturing this moment of apparent generosity, his expression radiating benevolence. Because at Novartis, we believe with every fiber of our being that every child deserves a fighting chance at life. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause, and Charles soaked it all in with the satisfaction of a performance well executed. What none of them knew, what the cameras would never capture, was that earlier that same afternoon, he had personally killed research into 3 rare diseases without a second thought. The patient populations were too small, the markets insufficient, the return on investment negative. It was just business, nothing personal. At exactly 10:40 that evening, Charles felt something distinctly off beginning in his stomach, a flutter that didn't belong there. Nesander de Nenen Satanend. Mild nausea began creeping up his throat, making the champagne taste wrong. He mentioned it briefly to his personal assistant and then laughed it off with practiced ease, blaming it on too much rich food and the stress of hosting such an important event. 12 floors down in the forgotten basement, Benjamin suddenly closed the medical textbook he'd been reading with an abruptness that made his father look up from the security monitors. "Dad, inadisi in Atans." His voice emerged quiet and careful, the way it always did when he was processing something important. "There's a smell coming through the ventilation system, something that doesn't belong here." Gerald Turner looked up from the bank of security monitors that showed every corner of the hospital's vast complex. "What kind of smell are you talking about, Ben?" "It's coming from the elevator shaft carried down through the ventilation system," Benjamin explained, his hands beginning to shake in that particular way that happened when his senses detected something fundamentally wrong with the world around him. "It's a chemical smell exactly like the one from the research lab where Mom used to work before she got sick. Someone upstairs is very ill, Dad. Seriously ill." Gerald frowned with the kind of concern that came from years of learning to trust his son's unusual perceptions. "Ben, you can't possibly smell something from 12 floors up." "I can smell it clearly, Dad." Benjamin interrupted, his eyes remaining fixed on the notebook in his lap, specifically on page 2863, the chapter he had been reading obsessively for 3 days straight. "The hospital's ventilation system carries every scent throughout the building, and metabolic acidosis has a very distinct smell that most people can't detect. It's sweet but fundamentally wrong, like fruit that's rotting from the inside out." Gerald had learned over the years not to question his son's extraordinary senses even when they seemed impossible. Benjamin couldn't tie his own shoes without getting frustrated to the point of tears, couldn't hold a normal conversation without staring intently at the floor, but he could smell things, hear things, and see patterns in the world that simply didn't exist for neurotypical people. "It's probably nothing serious," Gerald said, though his gut instinct was already disagreeing with his words. By 11:15, Charles Whitfield's mild discomfort had evolved into something that could no longer be dismissed or laughed away. Sharp pains were radiating through his abdomen, like something was systematically tearing him apart from the inside, and no amount of antacids or deep breathing was making any difference. By 11:40, he was lying on a gurney, being rushed through the hospital corridors into the most expensive VIP suite the hospital offered, surrounded by staff who were trying desperately not to show their panic. In the basement, Benjamin's head suddenly snapped up from his book and he found himself staring intensely at security monitor 12, which showed the 12th floor in grainy black and white. Doctors were flooding into a room with the kind of organized chaos that happens when someone critically important is dying despite every effort to save them. "That's him?" Benjamin whispered, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "That's the person I've been smelling." "Who are you talking about?" Gerald asked, already moving toward his son. "The person with the metabolic acidosis smell, the one whose scent has been coming through the vents. Insatindi ausan dindi in indi." Benjamin's voice cracked with the weight of recognition. "Dad, he's showing exactly the same pattern, the exact same progression." The room seemed to go cold as understanding dawned. "What pattern, Ben?" "So, anendi idin ende." "What are you seeing?" "Mom's pattern," Benjamin said simply, and those two words contained 3 years of grief and study. "He's dying exactly the way Mom died." The room went cold with the weight of memory. 3 years ago, September 22nd, Sarah Turner had been admitted to the 8th floor of this very same hospital. She'd made 4 ER visits in just 2 weeks, each time describing the same symptoms: abdominal pain that felt like knives, nausea that wouldn't stop, weakness so profound she'd collapsed during her janitorial shift while cleaning one of the research labs. Every single time, they had sent her home with dismissive diagnoses that explained nothing. Gastritis, they'd said first, then irritable bowel syndrome, then anxiety, as if the pain was something she was imagining. One doctor, Gerald would never forget his face or his condescending tone, had actually written drug-seeking behavior in her chart, implying she was faking illness to get prescription medications. She had died after 18 hours of screaming and agony that doctors continued to insist was psychosomatic, that existed only in her mind. Weeks later, when the autopsy results finally came back, they revealed the truth. Acute intermittent pharia, a disease so rare that only 1 in 100,000 people would ever develop it. So rare that most doctors went their entire careers without ever seeing a single case. If someone had known what to look for, if someone had ordered a $50 test, if someone had simply listened to what she was saying instead of dismissing her as hysterical or drug-seeking, she would still be alive. Gerald remembered that last terrible night with clarity that hadn't faded even slightly. Sarah's hand had been clasped in Benjamin's small fingers, her voice barely rising above a whisper as she said, "I love you most, baby, more than anything in this world." Deninda darsanda desandatin. Then the seizure had begun. The violent convulsions that doctors insisted were dramatic behavior designed to get attention. Benjamin had been only 10 years old at the time. He hadn't cried at the funeral, hadn't shed a single tear since that night, had just started reading with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Medical journals stolen from trash cans, textbooks found in hospital dumpsters, case studies that researchers had discarded. He consumed them all. "I could have saved her," he would whisper at 3 a.m. when the tears finally came in the darkness of his room. "If I had known then what I know now, if I had understood the patterns, I could have saved Mom's life." Gerald looked at his son now, 13 years old, wearing a hoodie he'd worn for 3 days straight, unable to meet anyone's eyes directly. The world called him broken, damaged, someone to be pied or ignored. But those eyes that couldn't make contact saw absolutely everything. "I need to go up there right now," Benjamin stated with sudden urgency. "That man is going to die, Dad, exactly like Mom did, and they don't know what's causing it." "But I do. I know exactly what's wrong." "Ben, you can't just walk into 'he's going to die' and they won't know how to stop it." Benjamin interrupted, his hands clutching the notebook that had become his constant companion. "But I have proof right here in my notebook. The case study they threw away 8 years ago. The research from Novaris that could have saved Mom if anyone had paid attention." Gerald's throat tightened painfully as understanding crashed over him. If they could somehow save this man, this rich, powerful man who had probably never looked twice at people like them, then maybe Sarah's death would finally mean something. Maybe she would smile from wherever she was now, knowing that her suffering had prevented someone else's. "Okay," Gerald said, making a decision that would change everything. "Let's go save a life." They ran for the elevator with a desperation that comes from knowing death is racing against you. Gerald's security badge was barely authorized for floors above 11, but he swiped it anyway, praying it would work. The elevator lurched upward with agonizing slowness. Each floor marker another reminder of time slipping away. The floors ticked by with excruciating slowness. 7, 8, 9, each number a reminder of his mother's final hours. Benjamin's breathing was coming too fast. The fluorescent lights overhead were far too bright for his sensitive eyes, and he was steaming, fingers tapping against his leg in that rhythmic pattern that helped him manage overwhelming sensory input. 10, 11, 12. The elevator doors finally slid open with a soft chime that seemed obscenely cheerful. A doctor stood directly in front of them, blocking their path like a wall of professional authority. He was older with gray hair, perfectly styled, and expensive glasses that probably cost more than Gerald's monthly salary. Gerald recognized him instantly, and his stomach turned with the recognition. Dr. Richard Hayes, the physician physician who had written drug-seeking behavior in Sarah's file, the man who had let her die because he was too arrogant to consider that he might be wrong. Hayes looked at Gerald's security uniform with the kind of thinly veiled contempt that came from a lifetime of believing some people were simply worth more than others. You work in the basement, don't you, Turner? What exactly are you doing on the VIP floor? In sape din den sanbrinden de sining, not sir. Benjamin gripped his father's hand tightly and whispered so quietly that only Gerald could hear the words. They won't believe me, Dad. They never believe people like me. But I have proof in my pocket. The memo that shows what really killed Mom. Dr. Richard Hayes remained standing in the elevator doorway like an immovable barrier of professional authority and class prejudice. I asked you a question, Turner. What are you doing on this floor? Gerald's badge told the whole story in a single glance. Security officer, night shift, employee number 3891. Someone who belonged in basement and service corridors, not on floors where billionaires receive treatment. So, das den Dynasteinad. There's a medical emergency happening, and my son knows exactly what's wrong with your son. Hayes interrupted, his smile cold enough to freeze water. The one who dropped out of middle school because he couldn't function in a normal classroom environment. That son. His eyes flicked briefly to Benjamin and then away, as if the boy wasn't worth sustained attention. Mr. Turner, I have 30 years of medical experience and training. I attended Johns Hopkins Medical School and completed my residency at Massachusetts General. Are you seriously trying to tell me that your 13-year-old dropout son knows something that I don't? Each word landed like a physical blow designed to remind them of their place in the hospital's rigid hierarchy. Benjamin's hands were shaking more violently now, and the fluorescent light seemed to be getting brighter and more painful with each passing second. Gerald recognized the signs immediately. In less than 2 minutes, his son would shut down completely, retreating into himself where nothing could reach him. Please, Dr. Hayes, just let him look at the patient for 1 minute. Absolutely not, Hayes declared with finality. We don't allow children with special needs to wander into critical care situations where they could interfere with actual medical treatment. Through the gap beside Hayes's rigid form, Gerald could see directly into the VIP suite. Number dienens im descendants. Charles Whitfield was seizing violently on the bed, his body arching impossibly despite the restraints holding him down. The machines surrounding him were screaming their various alarms, creating a cacophony of imminent death. 14 doctors surrounded the bed, shouting over each other in escalating panic, throwing out diagnosis and treatments with increasing desperation. Lipase levels are completely normal. This isn't pancreatitis. CT scan shows no evidence of aortic dissection. Could this be some kind of toxin exposure? Toxicology screen came back completely clean. They were drowning in their own expertise, throwing every treatment they knew at shadows and ghosts while the real cause remained invisible to them. Benjamin stood perfectly still, staring through the window with an intensity that suggested he was seeing far more than just a dying man. His lips moved silently, counting something that only he could perceive. I've seen this exact progression before, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Hayes heard despite the noise and turned sharply. You've seen what exactly? The way his body is moving, the specific pattern of writhing. That's visceral neuropathic pain, not regular pain. Benjamin pointed at the catheter bag hanging beside the bed. Look at his urine color. It's port wine, a very specific shade. That's not blood contamination. That's phosphobilinogen accumulation. Hayes actually blinked in surprise. What did you just say? Acute intermittent pharia, Benjamin stated with absolute certainty. And you're giving him barbiturates. I can see the IV bag from here. It's phenobarbital. Barbiturates are one of the primary triggers for pharia attacks. Every dose you give him is actively killing him faster. The silence that followed was absolute and crushing. Porphyria occurs in 1 out of every 100,000 people, Hayes began, his voice uncertain for the first time. The statistical probability of encountering it is, my mother had it, Benjamin interrupted, his voice going completely flat and factual, the way it did when he was stating irrefutable truth. She died on the 8th floor of this hospital exactly 3 years ago, September 22nd. You were her attending physician, Dr. Hayes. You wrote drug-seeking behavior in her chart. You told her the pain was anxiety and stress. You sent her home 4 separate times while she was dying. Benjamin's voice didn't waver even slightly as he continued. 18 hours after you sent her home the 4th time, she was dead on our bathroom floor. Every trace of color drained from Hayes's face as memory crashed over him. I see hundreds of patients every month. I can't possibly remember every individual case. Sarah Turner, Benjamin continued relentlessly. Employee number 4126, janitor in the research wing, 35 years old when she died. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket with trembling hands. The document, old and worn, photocopied so many times it was barely legible in places, but the Novartis Biosystems logo remained perfectly clear at the top. The date read March 15, 2017. Gerald had never seen this document before in his life, and he stared at it in shock. What exactly is that? Hayes demanded, his professional authority crumbling. It's an internal research memorandum from Novartis Biosystems, Benjamin explained, unfolding it with meticulous care. They wanted to develop enzyme replacement therapy for acute intermittent porphyria. The project was budgeted at $8.5 million over 5 years. It could have saved approximately 2,000 lives globally and taught an entire generation of doctors how to recognize and treat this disease. He pointed to the signature line at the bottom of the document where the project's fate had been sealed. Project terminated. Market too small. ROI negative. The signature read Charles Whitfield, CEO. The man who's dying in that room right now. Benjamin's voice cracked with emotion he could no longer contain. He personally killed the research that could have saved my mother's life. He buried it because the patient population wasn't profitable enough for his shareholders. Hayes stood frozen, unable to process what he was hearing. Gerald's throat was so tight he could barely breathe. Ben, where did you get that document? From the trash on the 3rd floor 8 years ago, Benjamin said simply. Someone threw away all the terminated project files after the board meeting. I kept them. All 12 research projects, 12 different rare diseases, all of them buried for profit. A desperate shout came from inside the suite, cutting through their conversation. He's crashing, heart rate dropping below 40. Get the crash cart in here now. The alarm screamed even louder, the sound of death approaching rapidly. Hayes looked at the memo in his hands, then at the dying billionaire visible through the window, then at the boy he had dismissed just seconds ago as irrelevant. If you're wrong about this diagnosis, I'm not wrong, Benjamin said with absolute certainty. I've studied this disease every single day for 3 years. I know every symptom, every diagnostic test, every treatment protocol. I know it better than anyone in that room because they read about it once in medical school and then forgot it existed. I learned it by watching my mother scream in agony while you told her she was imagining the whole thing. The machines were continuous alarms now, the unmistakable sound of death approaching with certainty. Hayes closed his eyes and made the choice that would save a life. You have 2 minutes. If you're wasting our time, I won't waste a single second. Benjamin promised, already moving forward. Benjamin stopped at the window and pressed both hands against the glass, his reflection showing a determination that belied his 13 years. I need someone to get me a Woods lamp immediately. Ultraviolet light, 365 nanomi, he stated with clinical precision, and run a Watson-Schwartz test on his urine right now. 2 milliliters of urine, 2 ml of Elix reagent. If it turns cherry red, that's your definitive diagnosis. Do it immediately. Hayes stared at Benjamin for one more long second, seeing something he'd missed before, then opened the door to the suite. The boy everyone had dismissed walked into a room full of doctors who had spent entire careers ignoring people exactly like him. All 15 doctors turned simultaneously, and the room went silent, except for the machines and Charles Whitfield's labored breathing as he continued dying. Benjamin stood in the doorway, 13 years old, wearing a worn hoodie, clutching his notebook like a lifeline with Gerald standing protectively behind him. Dr. Susan Miller was the first to speak, her voice sharp with indignation. Who authorized them to be in here? Hayes stepped forward with newfound conviction. The boy knows the diagnosis when none of us could figure it out. Nervous laughter rippled through the room, dismissive and uncomfortable. Dr. James Cooper didn't even try to hide his contempt for the situation. We have 15 physicians in this room with a combined 200 years of medical experience, and you're telling us a middle school dropout has solved this? Benjamin walked directly to the bedside without asking for permission, his focus entirely on the dying man before him. Whitfield's skin had turned the color of concrete, gray, and lifeless. His lips were a disturbing shade of purple-black, and his body was convulsing despite the restraints holding him down.